That introduction. Okay, yes. So thank you for that introduction, and thank you everybody for coming today and sticking around. So breast cancer has shifted from a highly stigmatized disease to one that has garnered a lot of public attention in recent decades, probably most visibly with a lot of the popular mainstream fundraising and awareness campaigns. And it tends to be attached to particular types of knowledge, very individualized, looking at lifestyle factors, genetics, as well as very focused on, finding the cure instead of looking at causality and prevention. Through my doctoral research on occupational disease recognition, I became particularly influenced on literature in the field of ignorance and on feminist approaches to materiality. So ignorance looking at not just what is known, but also what is not known, or what claims not to be known, as well as the social implications of this. And then materiality, looking at the materiality of the body and the environment. And I believe both of these approaches could be useful in unpacking contestations over causality in the context of occupational disease recognition, specifically within the workers' compensation system in Ontario, in Canada. So in beginning to kind of think through these theoretical pieces, I draw from some of the work I've been doing. Specifically, I'm going to draw some of the responses from the occupational disease advisory report. We'll also consider the particular difficulties of recognizing breast cancer as an occupational disease. And in looking through this, I aim to kind of begin to demonstrate and begin to think through how ignorance may be actively constructed in these contexts by calling, they were calling for scientific certainty while also emphasizing disease causality. And doing so in a manner that constructed rigid boundaries about what can be known and how it can be known, as well as also assuming bodies as impermeable to occupational hazards. So in this regard, they argue for the need to conceptualize bodies as interconnected within occupational contexts, and I further place consideration to the importance of bringing biology into feminist theory as a way to better understand the material effects that labor processes have on working bodies. So in 2004, almost 200 publicly reported responses were submitted to the draft report of the chair of the Occupational Disease Advisory Panel. One of the most significant debates was over how to conceptualize causality and how to understand this in looking at linkages between ill health and occupation. Employer-oriented responses tend to emphasize the need for a high level of certainty, specifically scientific certainty, and specifically through certain types of epidemiological studies, while at the same time accentuating the complexity of many contemporary diseases, such as cancer, and arguing that really they constitute diseases of everyday life and therefore shouldn't be compensated because to do so would create a financial strain. Encountering such claims, labor-oriented responses emphasize the necessity to establish causality based on legal rather than scientific principles of probability, while further acknowledging the problems that arise when epidemiological studies are situated as the most important forms of knowledge and evidence in all decision-making processes. It was also pointed out, for example, that diseases such as cancer are characteristically diseases of industrial civilization, and ultimately it's workers and the families that pay the cost for these diseases. The difficulties of recognizing breast cancer are enmeshed in these broader contestations and in this broader structure of occupational disease recognition. And while breast cancer has been formally recognized as an occupational disease within some workers' compensation systems in some jurisdictions, so for example in Denmark, nighttime shift workers, it's recognized that breast cancer is occupationally related for them. And there's been research done on occupational factors related to breast cancer. But it's argued that scientific research on occupational causes of cancer have been largely overlooked. This is further reinforced by contemporary knowledge paradigms of epidemiology and toxicology, where focus is cast predominantly upon genetics and lifestyle factors within epidemiology, and assumptions that the dose makes the poison within toxicology. So such approaches, it's been argued, are ill-equipped to deal adequately with a lot of the issues that are arising surrounding knowledge on breast cancer, such as endocrine disrupting chemicals, EDCs, and the multiple cumulative low-dose exposures. So such contestations, they manifest themselves between experts on breast cancer. And just to kind of briefly spotlight an example of this within the Ontario context, there was a study done looking at the Windsor area, an epidemiological study done that took into account occupational factors and found an increased risk for some occupational groups. So for example, women in plastics assembly had like a twofold risk of breast cancer. And the study got a lot of media attention. It got an award from the American Public Health Association, but it was very hotly contested by medical and scientific experts, both within popular media as well as through academic journals. So one prominent researcher and academic of breast cancer in Canada, his response to the study was, there's been no compelling evidence yet that's strong enough that we should regulate workplace exposures with breast cancer. That's his response to a study that's trying to demonstrate evidence that there is some risk here. So the politics of ignorance, the call for attaining stronger evidence by doing more research has been highlighted in many other contexts as a way to delay recognition of causal connections, with work done on the tobacco industry kind of being the epitome of how these controversies have been fueled and dragged out. While commonly held conceptualizations of ignorance tie in with understandings of a lack of knowledge, and this is how many dictionary definitions define ignorance, recent literature has taken up and critically engaged with this concept to demonstrate that ignorance is not a naturally occurring phenomenon, but that it's actively produced and maintained, and that it's a political process infused with power relations. For example, as Proctor argues, ignorance is solely one of the most prominent features of knowledge about cancer in the late 20th century. Ignorance is not just a natural consequence of decisions concerning how to approach or neglect what could and should be done to eliminate the disease. So through the ODAP draft report responses, the concept of ignorance may be particularly useful in unpacking how there were calls for scientific certainty within a context of complexity. As such calls provide a useful argumentative pattern to deny disease compensation claims by emphasizing the uncertainty of linkages between ill health and occupation based on the complexity of disease etiology. This makes the recognition of occupational diseases pretty much an impossible task, and this was acknowledged by both the employer-oriented and the labor-oriented responses. And in doing so, there was a tendency within employer-oriented responses to construct very rigid categories. So for example, the strict requirements for and the boundaries around what constitutes evidence and knowledge in this context, but also in terms of trying to separate, for example, occupation from everyday life, as if occupation isn't intertwined in everyday life within capitalist societies. And in doing so, reinforced assumptions of the human body as impermeable to the ill health effects of occupational chemicals and processes. And it is in this sense that feminist approaches to materiality provide useful insights as a way to deconstruct such assumptions. So many recent feminist approaches to materiality take as a starting point the necessity to give proper attention to the material, specifically the materiality of the body and the natural world, as well as to critically engage with the tensions and limitations of approaches that have tended to reinforce dichotomies such as biological, social, cultural nature, and human, non-human animals, to name a few. In raising such concerns, some have argued that by situating the biological as the object of critique, feminists have placed it beyond the paradigm of what can or should be engaged with. In this regard, many have pointed instead to the need for an interactionist ontology and to conceptualize these areas as intra-connected. For example, by emphasizing, as Davies does, how there's an entanglement, a non-separability of biology with and within sociality. And it's here that I've been particularly influenced by Nancy Tuana's concept of porous bodies as a useful way to emphasize how our bodies are not impermeable to environments around us. So using the plastics industry as an example, Tuana demonstrates how the viscous porosity of bodies belies any effort to identify a natural divide between nature and culture. The parts of plastic become as much as part of my flesh as the parts of the Coke I drink. Once the molecular interaction occurs, there's no divide between nature, culture, natural, artificial. Or simply put, plastic becomes flesh. So in bringing these pieces together, to understand our bodies as porous rather than as discrete entities from our occupations, as well as carefully engaging with matters of biology, both in terms of disciplinary focus and bodily processes, is particularly valuable in looking at issues around occupational health. Labor processes have material impacts upon the physical body. The cumulative exposures to toxic chemicals, repetitive movements, and EDCs continuously create inequalities at the site of and within the body. The necessity of an interdisciplinary approach has also been recently taken up, one that engages with biology has also been recently taken up by some Canadian scholars aiming to develop a feminist political economy of pollution, where they highlight how, in looking at the gendered effects of health in relation to chemicals and toxicity, they don't dismiss the biological differences between men and women, and they argue that these differences often account for the increased burden on women's bodies resulting from toxic chemicals in the environments in which we live. A material approach that connects with notions of ignorance is actively created and maintained through political processes provides an intriguing point of critique here, as its potential lays in the ability to illuminate the strategies of ignorance constructed through ideas of impermeability and rigid boundaries. So, for example, as mentioned, a common way of placing epidemiological evidence, certain types of epidemiological evidence, upon a pedestal within these knowledge contestations was to devalue other forms of knowledge and evidence. So this included, workers' own knowledge, qualitative studies, as well as animal studies. So, if an ill health effect was noted in animals, they would kind of dismiss this as having relevance to humans. Such claims construct ignorance by placing limits on what can be known or proven, for example, by arguing that a known carcinogen to animals has unknown implications to human health, and in continuing to conduct business as usual. In doing so, it also reinforces many of the boundaries that the material approaches seek to deconstruct. Well, as Nancy Langston observes in her historical tracing of DES, we have this absolutely bizarre notion that humans are separate from the rest of life on Earth. And as Proctor raises the important question, why was the human liver cancer hazard of vinyl chloride discovered only in the 1970s, while there was evidence of danger to rodents for almost 20 years? Just to conclude quickly, a feminist approach to materiality that problematizes such boundaries while keeping in purview the myriad ways in which ignorance may be manifested, thereby can provide illuminating insights as to why it has been so difficult to attain recognition for occupational disease in general, and for breast cancer more specifically within Ontario. But in saying this, of course, it's important to be continuously reflective of going through such tricky waters, because obviously, biological arguments have been used to justify many kinds of inequalities, biologically senseless claims and all that, and to be cognizant, as Andrea Doucet points out, of the political and social consequences of interpreting these arguments in simple or politically conservative ways. Thank you.